on the lecture of boundaries or borders. Remember, a boundary is some way of separating one country from another, and whether that is a visible line on a map or in this case a river. And here you can see, Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay that are separated by a river, and this presents what we call a natural boundary. And so natural boundaries are typically physical geographical barriers such as rivers or lakes or mountains or oceans or something that makes it really clear. And so really these are typically pretty undisputed borders. They're very clear. Unless you have an aggressive country that's on one side of the boundary or another, it's really easy to just say, hey, look, it's very clear. This is my country, this is your country. And these borders tend to work pretty well. Okay, an artificial boundary. So again, if you need to, you just fast forward through this part. But if you were not in class and you need to do this in your key term slides, an artificial boundary is one that is just man-made. Typically speaking, it's not created with regard to the geography. Whereas if you look at the west side of Namibia, you can see that that's like the coastline going along with the land where it meets the ocean. Excuse me for the bell. But then that eastern side there, that's just probably what they did is they used latitude and longitude, and they just made a straight line down. And so that's just kind of an artificial boundary. All right, and then we ended in class with this one, an antecedent boundary. So an antecedent boundary is something that's created before the ecumene exists. And remember that an ecumene is a part of the world where there are humans inhabiting it year round. And so this border between Canada and the United States makes a really good antecedent border because when they made that border on the 49th parallel, and you can see where the 49th parallel is going off into the distance, even to degrees some today, there's not a lot of people living right at that border. And so since an ecumene did not exist, then that's why it's called an antecedent boundary. Okay, so again, an antecedent boundary is a boundary that is created before there is permanent settlement in the area. Now, a subsequent boundary, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite of this. Now, when the boundary is made, there's already people living there. And whether those people were, considered in making that boundary, well, that's another thing. But if there was people, that lived in this area when the boundary was made, that's a subsequent boundary. A good example of this would be like West Virginia. So if you didn't know this, before the Civil War, there was no West Virginia. It was all just Virginia. But the western part of the state, they were against seceding from the Union. And so the eastern part seceded, and in the western part, they became part of the Union. And so they became the province of West Virginia. And there were already people living there. They had made a conscious decision. Again, sorry for the bell. They had made a conscious decision that that's where they wanted the boundary to be. And so since an ecumene existed, that is what we call a subsequent boundary. All right, not to confuse you any further, but now we're going to talk about a specific kind of subsequent boundary that is called a consequent boundary. All right, so a consequent boundary is a subsequent boundary, right? Which means there's already people living there, but it's a boundary drawn because of existing nationality. And what we mean by that is existing ethnicities. So in other words, not only were there people living there, but the boundary was drawn in a way to try to reflect where those ethnicities were. And so we sometimes call a consequent boundary an ethnographic boundary. Right? It is a subsequent boundary that is drawn with regards to the ethnicities there. And I think a really good example of this, if you look on this map, would be Slovenia, probably the best example. Macedonia is pretty close. Most of the people that make up the country or the political boundaries of Macedonia were already there. And to the most part, it's drawn because of that ethnicity. But I think stick with Slovenia there, where almost all the people that live there are also of that ethnicity. So if you're like, well, is this kind of a nation state too? Yes, but just remember right now we're focused on boundaries. And so this would be a consequent boundary. All right, so one more time. A consequent boundary is a subsequent boundary, and that is because there's people already living there. What makes it a consequent or ethnographic boundary is that that subsequent boundary is made in regards or with regards to the people that exist there. So it's drawn around the ethnicities. All right, geometric boundary. So this one's pretty easy. It's just an artificial boundary. So geometric boundary is an artificial boundary, and it's done usually in very obnoxiously straight lines. You can see Colorado, all four sides of Colorado are geometric, okay, which also means they're artificial. So a geometric boundary is kind of like a mathematical boundary. You can think of geometric boundaries as one where they use some sort of surveying to make straight lines. So, we talked about in class, if you look at the southern part of Oklahoma, that is going to be a natural boundary, whereas the top part is going to be an artificial boundary. And because they use latitude and longitude, then that would be a geometric boundary as well. So a lot of times, artificial boundaries, geometric boundaries, they're kind of used synonymously. But if we said, are the boundaries of Oklahoma geometric, that would not be true. But if we said, does Colorado have a geometric boundary? Then yeah, it really is. So when all sides of the state, or in this case, the province, if they are, if they're artificial, then we call it geometric. Okay, here's a good example of a voluntary border. Now, I don't think you guys have a key term slide for voluntary borders, but I do want you to understand that sometimes borders are disputed, and sometimes borders are pretty chill. And so you can see if you have time to mow fish between two countries, probably that the two countries are pretty at ease with one another. There's no border patrol or anything like that. You see old people sitting at the confluence of three different states or three different countries. It's a pretty peaceful voluntary border. All right, next one is called a superimposed boundary. A superimposed boundary is one in which either one or more of the groups don't agree to it. And so the boundary that you see here is the boundary between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea on the island, the greater island of New Guinea. The British were the colonizers of Papua New Guinea, and they basically took they took the longitude line of 141 degrees east, and they just threw a straight line down. They did make sure that you can see the little bend in that line where they included a bend in the Fly River. They wanted to make sure that they had the Fly River so that they could ship stuff in and out of that area. But really, it's just, whenever you have a superimposed boundary, you have a powerful, group like a country, and they say, you know what? We don't care if you agree to it. Here's the line. This is where it's going to be, and so we're going to impose the boundary here. Okay, if we go back to Namibia, that's what happened. Namibia didn't get to decide this is where the boundary was. This is where the Europeans said the boundary was. And you can also see that they made the superimposed boundary where they just arbitrarily said this is where it divides. That's a geometric boundary and it's an artificial boundary. So what we're going to see is that some of these kind of bleed over one into another. You don't have to have a distinct one necessarily. Okay, I'm going to stop there. If you want to stop this and do irredentism, you can, but I will do irredentism in class. And that concludes our discussion on boundaries today.